Plus Press Club debate. This week, the European Commission has proposed new guidelines for lifting confinement measures around the bloc. But the governments are going to be the ones to decide and to make the final decision. Is Europe ready to act in a coordinated fashion, or is the end of the lockdown going to be just as messy as the beginning of it? This is going to be the topic of our debate, and to discuss it today, I have with me three journalists from various corners of Europe. First, Karol Surovka from Polskie Radio, Alice Debetti from RTBF in Belgium, and Tobias Kaiser from Die Welt. And my name is Artem Skonakos. So let's begin in Brussels. Alice, European Commission on Wednesday published a long-awaited exit strategy, but due to fights among diplomats and civil servants, at the end of it, it's just guidelines for the sort of measures that countries need to take into account when they are talking about lifting the confinement measures. Did anyone notice that in Belgium?
The national newspaper covered the news, of course, but the Belgian citizen, they didn't pay so much attention because the Prime Minister has to do a speech that day. It took place on the same day, and at stake was a possible extension of the quarantine, and it has been extended until May 4. So the press conference of Ursula von der Leyen and Charles Michel was a bit unnoticed because of that, because of the speech of our Prime Minister. And actually, it's not so surprising because, as you said, the plan of the European Commission is just only recommendations, and it doesn't have a concrete impact on everyday life of Belgian citizens, unlike the federal government decisions.
Tobias, what about Germany? The government in Berlin announced that it will gradually start lifting the measures by opening some schools on May 4th. Did they pay any attention to the European Commission guidelines? What's your impression?
Well, they certainly didn't refer to the Commission guidelines when they announced first measures to exit the lockdown. However, we all know that the Commission guidelines or the outlines of the guidelines have been made available to national governments already last week. So I would assume that the German government, as well as the Länder governments in Germany and most other governments in Europe, knew what was in the guidelines the von der Leyen Commission proposed. And I would suspect that they all paid very careful attention to make sure that what they proposed would not counteract these guidelines. And we see in the German case that what Germany decided on does not in any way it's very compatible with the European Union's guidelines, actually.
I also read that it was quite difficult for the representatives or the leaders of the German federal lands to actually come to a common agreement. And could it be the sign that if it is so difficult to find a common language within one country, it might be actually unrealistic to expect that the 27 countries of the European Union will act in a uniform manner?
Well, let's be realistic. We're in a crisis, but this crisis is also a make or break moment for political careers. And politicians all over the world try to use this crisis as a means to show how great politicians they are, how great leaders they can be in this crisis. So it doesn't really come as a surprise that all the Länder chiefs in Germany want to show how well they are doing at handling the crisis, and that particularly those in the CDU-governed Länders want to show how great leaders they are, because later this year they will actually fight over who is going to be the candidate for the chancellor in the next elections. So those people that are discussed as possible candidates for the chancellor next year, those are the ones, Markus Söder and Armin Laschet, those are the ones who try to be very prominent when it comes to the measures in the corona pandemic. And we see this, of course, repeated and repeated all across Europe and around the globe, really.
So politics is never too far away, even in the times of pandemics. Now let's go to Poland. Karol, Poland early on has completely closed its borders for foreigners and implemented some other pretty strict measures. Are there any talks about lifting those measures now? And also a question to you, was there any reaction to the guidelines of the European Commission?
So the guidelines of the European Commission have been widely reported by various media outlets, partially because it was, well, some much needed good news, at least a hint of it. Even though there were no strict dates, it was still an information about a possible end of this all. So people were keen on hearing that. But as Alice said, when it comes to the citizens, it wasn't a hot topic issue because there were there was other stuff going on during that week. For example, since yesterday it is mandatory to wear a mask outside, so people were preparing for that. We're reading news about that. And also yesterday, the Polish Prime Minister announced his plan of leaving the crisis, well, sort of going back to normal. And he did not refer to the European guidelines, but this plan is in accordance with the European guidelines. So there are no set dates for most of the steps. And those steps will be strictly linked to the amount of new cases in Poland.
One thing that the European Commission is suggesting is for border regions to talk to each other. Good neighbors are talking to each other. That's what the President of the European Commission, Ursula von der Leyen, has said. Do you see in Poland that it's cooperating, or at least somehow talking to the neighboring countries, Germany or Lithuania, for instance, on the issue of lifting lockdown, or is it at least communicated as the solely national matter that will be decided in the national hands?
The Polish government has announced before introducing these new measures on the borders that it has consulted that with the governments of our neighbor states. So our Prime Minister talked to Chancellor Merkel about it, talked to the leaders of all the member states surrounding us. But, well, so I suppose that these issues are still being consulted with our neighbors, but this is not being reported on widely. So I just assume that this dialogue is being continued. The last news I heard of it was before introducing these new measures.
And now let's go back to Belgium. Alice, is Belgium taking into consideration what is being done in France or in the Netherlands, for instance? There is a lot of say that somehow Belgium is sometimes copying the measures that France is taking, but maybe in a slightly more sort of civilized manner, or the cautious.
But it's true that we can notice that the Belgian and the French crisis agenda has been quite similar since the start of the pandemic. For example, when the French President Emmanuel Macron announced the first containment measures, the Belgian government did the same the next day. Similarly, on the 27th of March, both France and Belgium announced an extension of the containment measures. But it doesn't mean that Belgium is copying all French measures. There are some differences between the two countries. For example, French people have to fill in and to print a certificate if they want to go out. In Belgium, we don't have to do that. Some French cities have a curfew. We don't have that in Belgium as well. And we can see some differences now. This week, we see that the crisis agenda became different. On Monday, the French president announced a possible lifting of the containment measure. He announced a potential reopening of school, resumption of economic activities on May 11, while in Belgium we remained quite cautious by not mentioning any time frame for a potential lifting of containment measures. So French and Belgians policies are very similar, are quite similar, but Belgium keeps its own pace, its own national logic.
Another subject that I would like to touch upon are the apps for contact tracing. That's something that's been widely discussed all over Europe, and the European Commission has also come up with some toolkits on this subject, and it talks a lot about the privacy. Alice, in Belgium, recent research tells us that at least in the region of Flanders, half or slightly over half of the population would be ready to use such an app. What's about the rest of the country?
Although there are no survey for the other part of the country, my feeling is that all Belgians share the same opinion. In South Korea, it seems that the idea to be traced was welcome in a better way. Here in Belgium, it's not the same. There is a general feeling of fear. When the Belgian minister in charge of digital policy announced that the government was working on a track and trace COVID-19 application, there were a strong reaction in the parliament from the left and the right parties. It raised a lot of questions, like how to secure the storage of the data, who has access to those data, how long will the data remain available. And for the moment, we don't have so many answers. We know that normally the app developed in Belgium will respect the privacy of the Belgian citizen, and it will be downloaded and used on a voluntary basis. So Belgian citizens won't be forced to use it. And according to Olivia Venet, it's the president of the Belgian Human Rights here in Belgium. That's one key difference between dictatorship and democracies, the voluntary basis. In China, the government is forcing the citizen to use that kind of app. They don't know the features of those apps. There is no transparency about privacy. In Europe, according to Olivia Venet, it should be the other way around. Citizen and political institutions have to work together, hand in hand, to stop the pandemic. And I think it's the general opinion here in Belgium.
And what about Poland, Karol? What's your feeling? Is there any debate on this app? Also, perhaps on how it could be used for, let's say, older people who don't have smartphones, if such an app is being introduced? Is there a lot of concern about the privacy of people, or is it not such a big deal as long as people can go out and move out freely again?
The issue of privacy has been mentioned by, for example, the opposition party, various media outlets, but it's not a major issue. People were focusing on something completely different, which is understandable in the last couple of weeks. Right now in Poland, there is one app which is mandatory for everyone who is in quarantine. So those are people who either came back to Poland after being in another
Yes,
and yeah, I'm back. Sorry, there was a hiccup. And 65% of all people who are in quarantine have downloaded the app. The rest of them either didn't have the hardware or they are visually impaired. But interestingly, the app is mandatory from April the 1st. And even before that, around 30% of people in quarantine downloaded the app. The reason being is that if they didn't, they would have to succumb to checks up by the police. So they had to show themselves to policemen in front of the door. And they didn't want to do that because they felt like their neighbors were treating them as lepers after they knew they were in quarantine. So they preferred the app than actually being checked by police. There is now talk about different app that would be not mandatory, but that will allow people to sort of go back to normal life. The app will be introduced this afternoon.
Okay. So very interesting developments in Poland happening. And finally, Tobias, Germans are known for very cautious approach when they are being online. Do you think that health reasons could be something that would make people perhaps be more willing to use such an app, or perhaps the German population would be willing to do that because they can move around freely?
Absolutely. We see in polls that people are very willing to use apps to communicate their status and to check whether they've been in contact with people who've had COVID-19. In general, Germans are quite touchy about privacy. They're also quite touchy about liberal freedoms. And the lockdown has, of course, infringed on liberal freedoms, but people have been very accepting of the lockdowns. Recent polls suggest people would even accept an extension of the lockdowns. So people know that compliance is essential so that the health system won't get overwhelmed. So people are willing to use these apps and they trust the authorities that once these apps are in place, we're not as quick as Poland, unfortunately, but they trust the authorities that once these apps are in place, that privacy standards are quite high. For example, retention of data, location data, there's a European approach now not to use location data. So all of these issues have been touched upon, and people are quite confident that they will be able to use these apps without having to fear about their privacy. The only question that remains is what happens once this crisis is over. What happens with these apps and with the tracking? That's the one thorny question in Germany right now.
Indeed, I'm sure there will be plenty of debates around this in the coming weeks, and we'll also have a lot to talk about. But for now, this is all we had time for. And I'd like to thank the participants of the Euranet Plus Press Club. Thanks to my guests, and thanks for watching. See you next time.